Hey everyone, welcome back. It's yours truly, Rocky. I know it's been 500 years, aka 3 months, but I'm back and I apologize. Unfortunately, life tends to do this horrible thing, and that is get in the way. Um, and also, I don't quite have the time yet to make a regularly scheduled upload routine or whatever. But I will be uploading regularly, which possibly means an upload once a week or once every 2 weeks. Definitely not 3 months from now. So let's get cracking, shall we? So, in our debut episode, I talked about the history of manga, Osamu Tezuka, and my thoughts on the light novel turn manga, soon to be anime, My Happy Marriage. In this episode, I want to briefly talk about the history of Manhwa, which is Korean comics. As a side note and reminder, I tend to cover titles that do not have an anime adaptation. The second side note is I will butcher words. I apologize in advance. I do try to pronounce these words correctly. I look up pronunciations, different kinds, not just like Google Translate, because we all know how reliable that is. Yeah, but I still screw up. Whatever. And I always apologize for it. I don't even know why. Like, I'm a human being, okay? Obviously, I'm not native Korean. Or, obviously, I don't speak Korean. So, anyways, that's just a side note. So, I also want to reiterate that I'm talking about the history of the Japanese influenced comics in different countries, but as it pertains to that country's origin of it. So I'm basically going to be talking about mostly comics from Asia. I probably will deviate a little bit, and you'll know about it. There's other things that I will be talking about, but for now, this is what Mangaverse is going to be about. The majority of it be centered on comics from Asia. And most of it will be, again, without an anime adaptation, although that also could change. So, I think a lot of people tend to focus on mangas, and they tend to miss out on other really amazing works outside of the US and Japan. And that's the kind of stuff that I want to talk about. So, having said that, let me get started with a quote unquote brief rundown on how manhwa started and how it evolved into what we now call webtoons. And by quote unquote brief, I mean not so brief because this is part one. Okay, here we go. So, the term manhwa originated from China's term manhwa, and it sounds the same thing, I promise, I know, but it's spelled slightly different. And it encompasses more than just printed comics. However, I'm going to focus on the term people currently recognize it for, which is print comics or webtoons. Where did it all begin? Well, that's a long story, and I'm trying to keep this brief, but the first Korean woodcut comic was made by an unknown artist in 1908, and it appeared in a publication of which I cannot pronounce, and so you will see the name on the screen. However, the first attributed comic was first seen on June 2nd, 1909, in the debut issue of the Korean nationalistic newspaper called Minbo, which is Korea's People Daily. And the artist cartoonist was Yi To-young, if I'm saying that right. And he was born in 1884, and he came from a noble family. And it was at around 18 years old that he studied painting and calligraphic painting, I hope I'm saying that right, under the tutelage of some popular artists at the time, and one of them was An Jung-se. When he was around 25 years old, he was asked to work as a cartoonist or manhwaga for the Minbo newspaper, which was something new to him, but that didn't stop him. So, censorship of press and speech were being implemented. Because, at the time, Korea was under Japanese occupation. But the little freedom that was allowed, the newspaper took advantage of. It was an opportunity to express the views of nationalism, the social and cultural repercussions that the Japanese occupation was creating and imposing on the Korean people, and the upcoming plans to annex Korea. Everything in these political cartoons were representing these topics, these issues. Lee Young was bold enough in his publications to even like call out specific people by their surname, because they were in favor of the Japanese occupation and annexation, and he wasn't afraid of it. But it got him and the editor, the newspaper, into a lot of heat, and a little over a year later, just happens when Japan officially annexed Korea, the government shut down Tainminbo. And afterwards, the censorships became stricter. There was really very little freedom of press. And there was a shift in genre being published at that time. I'm talking about manhwas that were catering to children and manhwas that were illustrations done just for humor and entertainment. The only newsprint in manhwas that were unrestricted were those that were in support of Japanese government. So, you could say whatever you want and have free press, do whatever, as long as it was pro-Japanese occupation. But if you understood Korean culture and like play on words and cliches and sayings and all that stuff, you would be able to catch that a lot of these cartoons that were meant for humor for kids had a double meaning to them. That was the way that they would kind of sneak in what they had to say. So it was very, very clever, and it was still satirical by nature. So towards the end, Yi decided to teach at the calligraphic painting school. I hope I'm saying that right. Under the direction of two famous master instructors, An Jok-si, remember him, and Ho Seok-jing. So Lee Joo-young helped to create and eventually became the director of the Calligraphic Painters Association in 1918. He died in 1933, and many to this day still consider him to be the pioneer of Korean comics. So let's jump, skip, and hop to the decades between 1920 and 1945. It's around the early 20s and 30s that we can see how manhwa start to really take off. Many new print media outlets were being launched, and these single-paneled satirical pieces and children's works were being printed by these news outlets. Two of which were Tonga Ilbo and, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Chosun Ilbo. Both were founded in 1920, and both are still active in business today. Also, side note, Chosun Ilbo is the Korea daily newspaper, and the Tonga Ilbo is East Asia daily. So from here on out, I'll be saying their English translation instead to refer to these two very popular print news outlets. So these original comics were single-paneled, and the majority of them were either one of two kinds. Basically, it was either the illustration was the main focus with very little text accompanying it, or it was the illustration but very text dominant. Of course, things evolved later. So right here, you can see two examples of the single panel variations. And these pieces were created by Kim Kyo-ti and Choi Jong-soo. A lot of their pieces were political and propaganda flyers against North Korea. But of course, other works were created by them and published in the newspapers of their time. So now enters Suk-ju, who happened to be one impressive man because he wore many artistic hats during his lifetime. He was a journalist, an illustrator, slash manhwaga, art director, art critic, film screenwriter, director, lyricist, and literally his list just goes on and on. He created the manhwa Strange Tale of a Braggart's Adventure in 1925 for the East Asia Daily. And he also had a series called Manhwa. There were satirical works based on the current affairs of life at that time and were published in the Korea Daily newspaper. And then he continued to produce content until around 1938 or so, and most likely because he decided to pursue other artistic adventures, which was around the same time, give or take, that the Manhwa ended its publication. Moving forward to the end of World War II and the Korean liberation in 1945. So now that Japanese rule of Korea ended, political cartoons and other genres like sports, romance, dramas, etc. started to grow. However, it was kind of difficult because during these in-between stages of recovery and just like regrowth, newspaper supplies and materials were limited and or very poor in quality. But within just a couple years, things started to change, and especially so around the time that the Republic of Korea was born in 1948, and Syngman Rhee became their first president. It was around this time that the Korean cartoonist Kim Young-hwan enters the scene. He worked as a successful cartoonist / artist in Japan under the pen name Kitagoji. When he returned to Korea in 1948, he founded the first manhwa-only magazine called Manhwa Hejin. Unfortunately, it was shut down because of a controversial front cover the government deemed to be inappropriate. He also produced English comments for an English newspaper, Seoul Times. He also created a piece called Rabbit and Monkey in 1946. To make a very complicated long story short, the people started to protest Syngman Rhee's administration, which became the basis for political cartoons to surface once again, and the emergence of some amazing contributors. So, fast forward a few years, the pressure and conflict between the Communist North and the Democratic South increased, which changed for the worst on June 25th, 1950, when North Korean troops crossed the 39th parallel in combat of South Korea troops starting what we know as the Korean War. During the Korean War, Kim Young-hwan created a very popular comic series named Kojubo Samguji, which roughly translates to Big Nose Man of the Three Kingdoms. It was a comic series that ran for a whole year between 1953, 1954, and then again in 1955, and it's presently collected and compiled under a 3-volume set. But also during the Korean War, Kim Young-hwan created a comic series called Soldier Todori, highlighting the courage, bravery, and hard work of South Korean soldiers. Now, Kim Young-hwan produced a plethora of comics for newspapers, for magazines, specific children publication outlets. With the changing times, the comics appearance also changed from the single panels that I mentioned previously to 4-panel strips. And he was one of many who began drawing under what was considered at that time the standard format. And just to reiterate, I am referring to comics that were in newspapers, because even in like comic books, like I had shown earlier with Samguji, they were not drawn with just 4 panels. Now I'm going to introduce to you to Kim Song-hwan. Not to be confused with Kim Young-hwan, which is probably a side note specifically for me. Kim Song-hwan was born on October 8, 1932 in Kisong. I could be spelling that wrong. Which at the time, did I just say spelling instead of pronouncing? Whatever. It's just like me. Which at the time belonged to South Korea. Kim Song-hwan documented both the civilian and military atrocities and conditions he witnessed through a series of sketches and watercolor paintings. Just want to mention that when he did start to do this, it was very early on in the Korean War. He was only 18 and he was still a student and working part-time as an editor. He gave himself the nickname Gobao, meaning strong rock. And honestly, that name was appropriate. 3 months later, Seoul was liberated and Kim Song-hwan became employed by the South Korean Ministry of Defense as a war artist. He continued to draw and paint the life around him during this conflict. However, during this time, Kim Song-hwan created the longest and oldest running comic strip in Korean manhwa history. His character, like his nickname, was called Gobao. The daily strip Old Man Gobao was published in 1955 in the East Asia Daily. Now, Old Man Gobao had a lot of humor in it, but some did cover political themes because Kim Song-hwan did see a lot of things. Kim's comic also did attract controversy. He was censored, fined, and even arrested. One incident occurred in 1958 under the new regime. He made a comic depicting janitors paying high respects to other janitors that were carrying buckets of feces from the presidential residence, which was called the Blue House. So it was called the Blue House Excrement Bucket Incident. And it landed him 4 days of interrogation by the government. And he said that the only reason why he did it was because he wanted to gain some, notoriety of some sort. And it kind of worked. Probably not what he intended. But in total, Kim Song-hwan created over 14,000 strips of the single strand-haired Gobao within a 50-year period. Sadly, Kim Song-hwan passed away in September of 2019 at the age of 87. And I believe his works are still on display in the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Central Seoul. In 1959, we see the artist-cartoonist letterer Kim Sano. He created a very popular science fiction manhwa series, of which I'm going to kill the character's name, called Lipai, or Leafy, the Fighter of Justice. The series was meant to encourage and depict the fact that the Korean people can persevere in spite of their hardships and struggles. He also published another series called Ripai, but it was also known as Freeble, and it ran from 1961 to 1967. In 1966, around that time, he moved to the United States and he opened his own publishing company, wrote and illustrated for different publishers, including Marvel Comics. But one of his most popular U.S. pieces was the Kung Fu series called House of Yang, which ran from 1973 to 1976. Now, Sano is recognized as being the first manhwaga creating manhwa-style comics in the United States. Now, after these accomplishments, he left the U.S. and he decided to travel a little bit, and influenced him to change directions. He began to create historical themed manhwas, this time with Western style paintings. One specifically was called The History of the Great Korean Empire. Today, at 86 years old, Kim Sano is currently residing in South Korea. Okay, let's rewind a bit. In the 60s, there was a huge manhwa explosion, so much so that manhwa bangs were created so that people can chill out and read manhwa with friends or whatever. Because of the huge popularity in manhwas, there were plenty of genres to choose from. Unfortunately, there was also a huge censorship explosion as well. You see, back in 1945, when Korea was liberated from Japan's rule, a law was passed and then was later revised in 1948. It was called Law for Punishing Anti-National Deeds. Basically, it was a super long list of anything that was deemed being against Korea, against Korean culture, anything in shape or form. The law was intended to protect and strengthen Korea's culture and all things involving Korea. My personal opinion is kind of understandable because of all the suffering the Korean people endured during that occupation. However, there's always a downside. This law was basically founded on anti-Japanese sentiment. Anything that came from Japan was banned. manga, music, plays, books, films, you name it. The penalties were pretty hefty, and the government at the time determined which genres, topics, news, or opinions were deemed to be fit, appropriate, and sanctioned for print and other media. So basically, it was a filter. They filtered everything, and they saw to it that, anything that was anti-nationalistic was gone. So in an effort to reestablish and uphold Korean culture, things got unbalanced and too censored. So continuing also in the 60s, we see publications that cater to middle school kids, teenagers, and even adults. We also see a piece created by Kim Jung Park called The Challenger. Now, one of the main sources of access to manhwas due to the censorship laws was, again, those manhwa banks. Manhwas had a negative connotation and reputation to begin with. They deemed, as inappropriate, they were violent, there were bad influences on people. So it just got to the point where the stuff that you were looking for was in those manhwa bands. But specifically, an issue arose because of the ban, and it was pirated mangas. They were being created and sold. Now, of course, the materials were altered to cater to the Korean readership, such as replacing Japanese locations and references with Korean ones. And unfortunately, that also meant credit to the original author and or artist was removed and replaced by someone else. So as manhwa still started to explode, and you can get like the banned stuff underground, quote unquote. It was easier to scan a copy that was brought in from Japan and sell it than to go through the process of making original content. So obviously this was horrible, right? Because, you're stealing content. The credit is being taken. The art is being taken. But, it was happening, and it might not have if the ban never existed or was lifted sooner. And these scans would pose a very big copyright issue in the future, but I will not be getting into that. Now, in the 70s, we see the emergence of works by Ko Woo-young, who published in the Daily Sports, where he was given a full page for his illustrations. And his works basically entailed historical pieces and folk tales from both Korea and China, which catered to a more adult audience. He was best known for his illustrative work, Samguji, based on a 14th century historical novel called Romance of the Three Kingdoms. But of course, during these times, Wu wasn't exempt from censorship just because he was helping to create historical themed content, which was one of the themes that was allowed. 100 pages of Samguji were censored for excessive depictions of violence and nudity. Yeah. And then there was Park Soo-dong, who serialized comic called Dolmen, I'm just going to say it in English, was published in the Sunday Soul. Also in the 70s came a very popular piece that was created by Lee Sung-moo. And Lee Sung-moo created his first romance series in the late 60s, but it was the popular series called Dokotak or Dokoteki, or Freckles, in 1971 that really took off. And it was basically all these stories about a short kid with troublemaking tendencies who loved and played baseball. The author also placed can't English in other manhwa series depicting him under different storylines but unrelated to each other. So his character was so popular and loved that a baseball cartoon series was created in 1980 called My Name is Dokoteke. Lee Sung-moo is also accredited and considered to be the father of sports cartoons. Now, the 80s come rolling along, the 90s, the early aughties, and then the rise of the webtoon. All these will be covered in part 2. So, stay tuned. Part 2 is coming, not in 3 months, maybe 6. No, it's coming soon. Until then, take care of yourself. Be good. Do good. Bye.